Welcome, folks, to another episode of the Coffee Roasters Warm-Up Sessions. Today we have our first guest right here in the room, in the podcast room. We had one that was overseas. We chatted with Taylor from Indonesia that works with coffee farmers, producers in Indonesia. But now we have our dear friend Edwin. Edwin, tell us a little bit about what you do right before we pour a cup of good coffee.
Sure. Well, first, thank you so much for having me here. It's a pleasure and a privilege, and it's exciting just doing this here in Bellingham.
Oh yeah, for sure.
For a lot of reasons, but my name is Edwin Martinez, and I grew up in Guatemala and started Onyx Coffee, and we have a small farm in northwest Guatemala called Finca Vista Hermosa. Nice. I've been living in Bellingham, Washington now for about 26 years now.
Wow.
That's a long time.
Yeah, that's
longer than me. That's for sure.
Yeah, that's pretty incredible. That's cool. Well, we'll dive into Edwin's story a little more here over the rest of the episode. But for now, let's pour some.
Yes, I feel like it's always my honor. Well,
yeah.
Edwin, you're gonna be using a cupping bowl. So this will be fun. Yeah. Gotta finagle over this mic so I can see. There you go. Don't want to pour too much. Those bowls get so hot.
Yeah. But dude, that's dandy. Wow. Enjoying coffee out of a cupping bowl. That's wonderful.
It's a very, very nice cupping bowl. Yeah. It's got a nice mirror, reflective, but yet very subtle.
Yeah. Yep. Little.
That's how we like it.
Branding.
All right. So if it doesn't, there's a few reasons that I'm going to preface this. There's a few reasons why this cup may not be our favorite. One, this coffee is super fresh. 2 days off of roast.
We should be cupping it in the bowl.
Not brewing.
Yeah, not enjoying.
Two, I can almost guarantee I did not use the right grind size. So
it's just a good thing I had you rinse those out because you'd be tasting whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sad part, it's lost, or it's not. I can't taste the complexity in it that we normally have.
I noticed a trend watching some of your videos on YouTube last night. You're often disappointed.
Oh gosh, that is not good.
It's not bad either.
Yeah. No, you're right. You're right. That's true. Why?
I don't know.
Not the case.
I feel like every single time I brew a cup of coffee, I feel like it could be better. There's always, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I want to say that's a very positive thing. Like sometimes I have a hard time savoring what's good. Savoring what's good. I kind of like how that sounds.
We need to create a show just for that.
Yeah.
I will say though, I think what I'm getting a little bit on the front end though, very briefly, and I'm sure if it just ages just a little bit more and we were able to dial that in or even brew it on pour over. I'm noticing on the front end very similar things to what I've noticed on just brewing it as a pour over. It's got an interesting sweetness that I probably wouldn't categorize as just chocolate. It almost like this. I think tropical fruit is a little too far. But what do we have? We have cherry, pear, and marzipan on the notes, and I'm getting some of that nice cherry, like something sweet on the front end, which is kind of enjoyable that I'm liking.
Yeah. I would say that it doesn't have as much acidity as I'm used to in this roast. So it's definitely lacking that. And then on top of that, there's that, can you taste that little weird aftertaste? And I'm like, that's gotta be the freshness.
Yeah, a little bit of astringency.
Yeah. A little bit, or definitely probably that grind size. So.
Which another constant problem. We never write down our grind size that we're grinding coffee on, and every week we're grinding new coffee.
Yeah,
and we're always eyeballing. So, but that being said, I think we've sourced a couple of coffees from you guys at Onyx, which have all been just a delight to enjoy. And one of the producers that we've been able to source coffee with you guys is Jorge Mendez, and his coffees, I feel like we've bought, I think, 3 different harvests, 2 from El Panal, 1 from Las Joyas, I believe, and just his coffees, especially the El Panal, just have this interesting flavor profile to them that it's so Guatemalan, but it's also so. It's also like pretty complex. It has like an interesting stone fruit, like pear, cherry, which I don't know. I've been enjoying.
Yeah. They definitely have flavors of terroir where, based on where they're located, it's not only high elevation, but they're a little bit exposed, so they get cooler winds.
Okay.
That come through the valley, and they're not catching as much as the warm winds that come from the northwest flowing through the whole region in general.
Interesting.
So the idea of microclimates in Guatemala is really interesting because you can actually get a very different flavor from the same botanical variety. We like to talk a lot about the differences in flavor and variety, and that's definitely a thing.
Yeah.
But the differences in some of the other elements of terroir can have a greater impact on creating a more different flavor. So if you have the same variety, but it's planted on this side of the ridge versus this side, it may get twice as much sun. And the other one, maybe with more shade, is cooler and it's growing slower. And it may not even fully develop. And so depending on what the weather's like, you can get a lot more sweetness just 2 meters away, being just on a different side of the ridge.
Yeah, that's incredible. I don't think I've heard the detail of that before. So that's pretty insightful. That's big.
Yeah, that's incredible. Just shows that like coffee is like, I mean, it just blew my mind when I read that coffee has over 800 flavor and aroma compounds.
Yeah.
As for wine, I think is at like 300. And it's like stuff like that where I'm like, that makes sense. It's mind blowing, but it's like, no, that's why coffee is so incredible. But obviously it seems like you know way more about origin and growing coffee than we do. How'd you bring us back to Edwin for Edwin's first kind of experiences in coffee?
Well, I don't know if you want me sharing this right now. What time we're doing this? It's light out.
It's
5:21, and we're drinking coffee.
Yeah.
This is very Guatemalan.
Oh,
Hey,
yes.
I like that.
So I was at SCA maybe 6, 7, 8 years ago, maybe 10 years ago. And the person who started the marketing company for Pinhalense, which is a manufacturer of coffee processing equipment, and I think they're the largest in the world.
Wow.
So from at the farm level. And this guy used to work for him doing sales, and then he started his own company marketing the same product from the company he used to work at, and that company grew to be larger than the manufacturer.
Wow.
So he was the speaker at SCA, and he shared Brazil actually had commercials that aired on TV where they were talking about their some of their economic investments internally. And so when you think about what can make coffee sustainable, Brazil's the largest producer in the world. It's like 35% globally. So if the weather is a little sketchy there, the market does weird things.
Yeah.
And so one thing that every producing country can do and should do in some way is how can you, and this is true globally, how do you consume things that you produce locally first?
Right.
And then look at the qualities. And then, of course, exports are going to be really important and often necessary. But in Brazil, they'll serve coffee. It's much weaker, but at elementary school.
At elementary
And
school?
so I remember when he mentioned that,
Yeah.
half the room, this is actually at a symposium. So that's, I think people paid $1,000
Yeah.
for a 1 or 2 day prior to SCA. And so it's a lot of executives and managers at larger companies or owners of small companies. And the room, it got quiet. There was kind of a weird reaction.
Yeah.
But for all of us who maybe grew up in coffee growing countries, I was like,
That's normal.
Yeah. So in Guatemala, I grew up, coffee was in the bottle, and some of my cousins, as they were infants and toddlers,
Yeah.
they just had coffee in their bottle.
Oh,
So
wow.
it's not this,
Right.
they're not,
Yeah.
I didn't grow up understanding, what's the proper ratio and,
Extraction.
TDS meter.
Yeah.
It's just brew the coffee, a little bit of coffee, lots of water. So it's really weak. And it's really just a lightly tainted coffee flavored water, and then put milk and sugar. So it was really more like a latte
Yeah.
Yeah.
where you forgot to put the coffee in it almost.
Yeah. Yeah.
But the coffee cup still had a few drips in it. And so I grew up just seeing that it was consumed morning, noon, and at night. And that's part of how it's easier to regularly drink coffee at night if it's brewed weaker. So
Yeah.
that's part of how I grew up. My grandfather's 102 this year. My grandmother's not alive anymore. She actually would serve the sugar into his cup. And he, until she passed away, did not know how much sugar went in his own cup.
Wow.
Yeah.
But there was always sugar in it.
Yeah. That's great.
So I think I grew up with a great familiarity with coffee from a consumer standpoint, and just we spent all of our holidays and time in the summer and Christmas, spring break at the farm.
Yeah.
So my experiences were, I think, very much both at the at the growing level, seeing what it's like to plant and literally get my hands dirty playing in a pile of dirt, and then planting coffee and then drinking really horrible quality, roasted poorly, brewed very weak, and really enjoying it.
Yeah. That's great. Roasted, what are we talking, like a pan?
Sometimes. There's actually now a brand called I think it's El Jarrito, which means like the little jar. It's kind of like a little carafe.
Okay.
And that's an instant product. And you tear this pack, and the pack itself, it says it makes like 8 to 10 cups. But if you're thinking of proper brew ratio, it maybe will make one.
It's like,
But the instructions say it's like 8 to 10 cups.
yeah.
And that's really common.
Okay.
And that's probably what most coffee farmers drink in Guatemala.
That's incredible, because it kind of, when we talk about, I don't know, as roasters, we're always thinking like, how can we roast this coffee so well that it actually lets the potential of the coffee shine to everything that the producer and the farmer were able to put into that, the potential in there. And we're always considering this, having the producer in the back of our head as we're kind of developing this bean. It's interesting though that how they're consuming coffee is actually significantly different than we in the States.
But I mean, I'm gonna assume that's changed over the course of the year or years, right? So
It's changed a little bit.
yeah,
It's changed a little bit.
yeah,
And
yeah. I would say like I love hearing stories like that. Like one, they bring a lot of value to me because there's this connection point for me of like something that I've in a similar way, definitely not even close, just similar tinge of my experience was like that. Like I spent some time in Costa Rica, like before I was in specialty coffee, before I, did anything coffee related, like my beverage was like a Starbucks cup of coffee, something super simple. But I had that moment of having coffee in the morning at the location that I was working at, and then walking down the hill to the bus stop and walking through a coffee farm.
Yeah.
And I did that multiple times because I worked in a lot of producing nations without, realizing. Did that in Brazil. I did that in Indonesia. And I think those experiences, similar in connection to like your story, is what actually drove me to want to be in specialty coffee. So that's like, I love hearing that. Like that, I'm like, oh man, that makes me energized, So you were saying like that was your kind of introduction to coffee itself. Like, so how did that move from that experience and story to like the professional side of coffee?
a lot of failure.
Of course. Yeah.
Just epic amounts of failure. And So, I mean, I think I always enjoyed I've always enjoyed the idea of developing and the creative aspect of innovation, and just seeing how challenging it is at the farm level when you try and make a plan and there's so much that's out of your control, and the decisions that you make are not really short term.
Yeah.
A lot of them are, but they're really driven by a long-term goal.
Yeah.
And that long-term goal sometimes means you make decisions that don't make sense at all in the short term. So when you plant a seed at a higher elevation in particular, so lower grows faster. This is true for anything you plant. And a quick parenthesis, it's a really, really simple way to boil down all the complexities of what makes sweet coffee slow growing. It's that simple.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of things that impact that.
Yeah.
So you plant the seed, and it's 7 years before we have a mature harvest. We're going to get fruit in maybe 2 or 3. It's going to be a little more substantial in 4 to 5, but it's going to really come around and have complexity that it won't have at 4 years, at about 6, 7 years. So seeing that was just hard for me to wrap my head around because I have a short attention span. And so to make a decision, what should we plant here?
Yeah.
Like, well, we're not going to know what it tastes like for 7 years. So these are things that I started thinking about maybe just 15 years ago.
Wow.
Yeah,
And so the farm, my grandparents started it in 1957.
Okay.
So then I think, okay, who else in my family, my aunts and uncles and my grandparents, my parents, have thought about these things? And so I started asking, and it really wasn't a question about what should we plant based on flavor at all. It wasn't even a thought. It was what's the best thing to plant based on what our neighbors recommend, or an agronomist.
Yeah.
And their recommendations are all going to be based on what's resilient and what's going to produce a high yield. And the quality element was not a big topic. So we were very lucky that we just didn't know of or have access to varieties that weren't going to produce a higher quality.
Yeah. Gotcha.
And then also at a higher elevation, there's just, some varieties that will really struggle. And so a variety that can do well growing slowly and requires a little bit more care is naturally a better fit, because the fact that it grows slowly means it's not going to require as much attention,
Okay.
as many inputs, because it's just going to go slowly, dependent on the soil and the limited resources. So I actually really wrestled through a lot of the questions of the time that it takes, because I remember asking my grandfather, okay, so if we plant something here, how long does it take before this is going to produce? And then how much is that going to produce? And what do we sell that for? And I was always asking these kinds of questions, trying to figure out like how it makes sense, literally.
Yeah. Right.
And it never made sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And to this day, it still doesn't really make sense.
Yeah.
Wow.
And so I've just kind of grown up constantly asking, how does this work? And I constantly find that it doesn't really work for the most part. And so that's part of, what's been an ongoing curiosity. So, but how I got into coffee really came, by choice, because that's just kind of how I grew up, was more here in Bellingham.
Okay.
I started an espresso cart on Meridian.
No way.
I think I've heard this.
I had
story.
a Mac Digit 1 group, Nuova Simonelli,
Ooh.
and I pulled shots. I don't even remember what coffee I was using, and people would ask to buy the pucks because they wanted to eat them, and so sure.
Why?
And this was when there were a lot of carts popping up everywhere.
Okay.
There weren't a lot of drive-throughs, and carts were a very common thing in Seattle.
Okay. What year is this?
This would have been, let's see, 95.
Ooh.
Fall of 95.
Okay. So that I would say that maybe I'm wrong, but that's like the prime of second wave coffee. Like,
Yeah. So
yeah.
people were learning about, like, the amazing thing was how many flavors existed of syrups. They just kept growing and growing.
Yeah.
And that was a draw. And
Yeah.
so a big value for carts, you needed a bigger cart because you needed to hold more bottles.
Yeah. Okay.
And you'd have this big display, and there was a lot of marketing from companies that would promote more of an Italian culture where you'd go to a bar, like a coffee bar, where it was also a bar where you could get a cocktail, but you'd have all these syrups on the wall.
Yep.
And so manufacturers, and there's a few in Seattle that did really well for a few years. And so the cart I got was actually a defective, rejected, made for a Chevron gas station. So it was Chevron blue. And there were a few chips on the, what is that called? It's like that plastic that you glue onto wood.
Ooh.
Yeah.
I can see it. I don't know.
But,
I don't know the word for it, but
Is
yeah.
it Formica?
I don't know.
I'm not sure.
But I can totally visualize.
I can visualize.
But it's a
it,
black and white, just the colors of a Chevron gas station. And so that's where I started.
Okay.
And I had 4 employees, and we were all at
Well,
Western.
you started with 4 employees.
Started with 4
Wow.
out of the
That's
gate.
bold. We started with 0.
Well, the reason I started with 4 is because I knew it wouldn't make money, so I had to have
Okay.
another job.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Oh, that's
Yeah.
that's interesting.
classic.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
interesting.
We know how that feels.
Yeah, and it eventually it covered its costs.
Yeah.
And then I learned, I got into catering,
Okay.
and that went really well. So that really was what kept it going. But so from there, just fast forwarding to, let's see, about 19 years ago, 20 years ago, I was working at a bank, U.S. bank here in Bellingham. And somebody came in and said, yeah, my husband's working with our neighbor, starting a company manufacturing roasters. Like, you mean roasting, not actually manufacturing roasters? No, they're making machines that roast coffee.
Wow.
That's interesting.
In Bellingham.
And somehow it came up that our family had a farm. And so she said, you should talk to them. Here. And she gave me her husband's number. So I called him, and I thought, I'm sure I'm confused. She's probably confused about what her own husband does. I'm like, but
Yeah.
that's what I thought.
Yeah.
Sure enough. It's a couple of guys that one winter they ended up, they ran out of coffee, and one of them was a combustion engineer. He had a doctorate in combustion engineering, and I think he worked at NASA, and he's from the UK, but he was living on Samish Island. And his neighbor was a tugboat captain. And he happened to bring back a half a bag of coffee from Panama a few years back that was just sitting in his garage of raw coffee. And he said, let's turn this stuff brown. You know about combustion? This needs heat. Let's bring some heat. And so they started a company. It was called Sid and Jerry's, and that was their names.
Okay.
Oh.
Kind of sounding like Ben and Jerry's ice cream. It became Coffee Kinetics. I was their first employee. And so I designed the roast profile on that roaster.
Wow.
By going to Diedrich and taking a seminar
Yeah.
and learning what they recommend. I'm like,
Yeah.
here.
Nice. That's good.
Because while I was hired as the expert, I really knew nothing. I knew a little bit more than they did, but I had no clue. And our family had a farm.
Yeah.
And so somehow, we were all kind of lost, but we all knew a little bit about what was coming together. And so I learned a lot through playing around with the roaster about roasting. And then we opened a cafe called Cafe Weiwei here in Bellingham. And people thought it was a paint store or a Vietnamese food. And we roasted 1 pound at a time to order. So you'd pick your origin, you'd pick your degree of roast.
Wow.
And almost 20 years ago, people were paying between $15 and $21 a pound for custom roasted to order. So it was,
Wow, that's impressive.
That's powerful.
you
That's-
mentioned
yeah.
earlier something that's literally bonkers out of this world. That's what that felt like.
Yeah. For sure.
It's just, I tried to calculate even though it made no sense comparing to what anyone else was doing, the cost of what we were doing, the labor, the lack of efficiency, the customization, and tried to put a value to it. And I thought, I'm not wanting to make this expensive, but it is really unique.
Yeah.
And so we sold a lot of coffee, and people found great value. They'd come and they wouldn't stretch and buy one and never come back as a curiosity. They would come back and they'd buy 2 or 3 at a time, every time.
Wow.
Because they were asking for a custom roast because they had a friend. It was almost like I need a gift. They're buying a lot of gifts,
Right.
but always something for themselves.
Yeah.
And each roast took almost 20 minutes because it had to warm up, and then it would go through the roast cycle, and then it would cool.
Yeah.
So from there,
So were batches that small? Like 1 pound, I guess, if someone, that makes sense. Okay. Wow. That's a lot of work.
yeah.
That's wild,
So
man.
that's kind of the
Yeah.
tipping point. That
Okay.
cafe was open for 2 years.
Okay.
And the first year, my wife Nina and we made about $2.30 an hour. This is what I figured based on the time we put in, which is more than the hours we were open.
Yeah.
Dividing that into our income, and we paid all our bills with that. We lived in an apartment, didn't have kids, and so we were pretty happy because the cafe closed at 3, so
Time.
it's not like we were working late hours.
For sure.
Still had to work, had time to work on the business outside of in the business. But it was that second year where really what we're doing now took roots.
Yeah.
Because I was bringing coffee. So the coffee we were roasting, I was buying from other importers.
Oh, okay.
Because I was searching, like, how can we buy our own coffee? I wanted to share our own coffee.
Right.
But it's in Guatemala, and we're here. And I'm going back to Guatemala, but how can I? And so at first I tried to solve my own problem myself. And I just brought it up in check-on suitcases. And then we'd have groups that would come and do projects, and maybe they were building a school or a house or painting. And so I'd have people bring 20 or 30 people at a time, bringing at that time up to the weight limits were higher on suitcases, and you could bring 2 and you didn't have to pay. So we'd max out 2 suitcases for every person.
Yeah.
And so like you have no idea how many times I've been to Value Village and Goodwill to get suitcases to give to people to bring back with coffee. So that's how I got into exporting and importing.
Okay.
That's powerful.
Wow.
I didn't have a license to do that. I just did it.
Yeah.
That's crazy. I love that. I don't know. I feel like I'm purely from a business standpoint. It's just like such a bootstrap, like
Let's get it done.
like such a rough, like down and dirty, like we're just gonna figure out how to do this with the bare minimum. Like we want to get coffee, and how do we do it? And you just go and you figure it out.
Yeah, like hearing you share that part, I can sense this like energy and this drive. So it has to be fueled by something. So that's what I want to know. Like you're going through all this hardship. You're making not a great amount of money, living in an apartment, but you're able to pay your bills. Now you're like importing coffee, the only way you know how to do it at this point probably, and you're still like, there's a drive for more. Like where's that like passion and drive coming from?
Well, it actually gets worse.
Oh, okay.
It gets worse because I went with my wife to Guatemala with the plan of, we were fairly newlywed, and so it was kind of an opportunity to have like an extended honeymoon. And for both of us, for her to really work on Spanish and me as well. And the third objective, and this was kind of what brought it up, and then we kind of built around it, was to get a license, because I just, as I told people, like, well, that's not going to scale.
Yeah,
Suitcases.
for sure.
We need to hire 100 employees with suitcases.
So it took 6 months. And that's, being bilingual, and I was studying international business. And so that was my interest.
Oh, okay.
And so I figured that if anyone could do it, I figured I could do it. Yeah, I was clueless. I was absolutely clueless. And so I went to the Coffee Producers Association and asked, we have a farm. I'm told that we can export our coffee. They said, yeah, absolutely. And so it was a process of asking questions where finally they gave me a form to fill out.
Okay.
But just getting to that first form, they had to loop in like 4 or 5 other people, and they had a meeting like 15 feet away from me, so I couldn't hear. I'm like, what are they talking about? I just want to apply.
Yeah.
Just give me the paper and I'll put the information on it. And so they told me that, well, we have a form, but it's not been approved by the board. And so no one's ever really done this before. No one's done it before? I'm like, yeah, so how does anyone export coffee?
Yeah.
If no one's got a license,
Yeah.
no one's gotten a license.
Yeah.
And so when I got a license at that time, it had just been grandfathered in, or you had to know someone.
Okay.
And so I was the first to go through the process and
Yeah.
really kind of developing the process. So it turned into almost a 3/4 inch thick book of pages. Eventually it was on a
Wow.
DVD. Now you can just go on your phone and click.
Yeah.
You still need a lot of help with attorneys and people that can help with those kinds of transactions because you need to set up a business and a business license.
Yeah.
So it took 6 months to get that. And that was just like the door open to then spend resources, time and money. And so we had sold coffee in an auction to someone in Japan for $1.65. So I thought, well, it's an auction,
Yeah.
so that must be a good price. I had no idea at the time that was actually below the cost of our
Okay.
production.
Yeah. Wow.
And I thought that must be a good price.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we've gotten less before, and this is more. So I committed to paying that to my family. And I took about 1/3 of a container, my first container, and my grandfather, my dad, and the next year, a producer neighbor came with us, but we went to the port, and I hired armed guards that traveled with us and the truck, and we stayed at the port. And then I snuck into the port because I wanted to go in. So I was actually sitting with the truck driver,
Yeah.
going into the secure area,
Huh.
and so really I was with our coffee. Our manager was sleeping with the coffee at the dry mill until we loaded it. So from
Yeah.
the time we brought it from our farm, like we didn't physically leave any space between the coffee and
Yeah.
us
Yeah.
until I put a lock on the container. And then I unlocked it at 1585 Mount Baker Highway, where we used to live.
Oh, dang.
And a 20-foot container backed up right off
Yeah.
Mount Baker Highway. Like, you're going to pass that
Yeah.
turn.
Yeah.
And we put it in our garage.
You
Wow.
should. I do want to interrupt you for a second. You should. What was that feeling like? Like your grandparents, your family, you're there, and you guys are about to export your first container. It's got to have been like a really, like, for your family, for that community, it's got to have been like a pretty monumental experience, or no?
It was really surreal because there's so many things about, the time element. For someone who grows coffee, your income comes very differently than, it's like any farmer.
Yeah.
Your income is not like a job where you get a paycheck every week or every
Right.
2 weeks or month. You get your entire annual salary, maybe in a day, but it's going to be condensed somewhere in a 30 to 90 day window. And it usually can be identified to just like 2 or 3 days where you get your entire annual salary, your annual income. And that income may be above your costs. It may be the same, it may be below, it may be way below.
Yeah.
And you don't really know that until you get there.
Yeah.
And most people that get there don't really know the expenses that they've
Lead up.
like what it's
Right.
cost to get there.
Right.
So even when you're there, a lot of people don't understand their cost of production, so they don't know if they're making money or losing money,
Yeah.
or how much they're losing or making. And that included us. But yet here we are, we're spending more money and still being clueless,
Yeah.
Yeah.
and watching it just go out into the sea.
That's a big risk. Yeah.
And even now I look back, and it's just, with
Yeah.
since COVID, there's just been these supply chain challenges where
Mm-hmm.
3 weeks ago, off the coast of LA, 62 containers. And I was just playing around. Like, if there's, let's say, if there's a high quality coffee and we value them at 100,000 a piece, If there's 1,000 containers per ship, that's $6.2 billion. It was just sitting there for a month. Like, what does that cost? Who pays for that? Someone does.
Yeah.
And that's if they're at 1,000 containers. And a lot of ships carry 10 to 20, like the biggest ships carry 22, 23, 24,000 containers.
Yeah.
So that would be 60 or $120 billion.
Wow.
Oh my gosh.
Just 3 weeks ago off the coast of LA.
Yeah.
Oh.
Wow.
Obviously it wasn't all coffee and they weren't
for
all
sure.
the biggest ships, but
Yeah.
so it was really surreal because I'm seeing it go out into the ocean and like I hope it makes it back to land.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I don't know what I'm going to do when it does, but I need to figure out how to sell it.
Yeah.
I can't sell it 1 pound at a time roasted, I don't think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And my goal was to sell it all raw.
At that point, have you made any kind of sales connections with roasters?
I made a lot.
Whoa.
I made a lot. So I sent samples out to about 150 people. I sent a couple thousand emails out, and I mailed postcards to, I think, 200 people, 200 companies.
Wow. So you did the back end work. You were heavy on the back end work before you ever like professionally imported.
I was kind of doing it simultaneously.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I had someone came in, Brian Schutte is his name, and he was studying international business, getting an MBA at Western. And he came to Cafe Wewe, our little cafe, and he said, I want to do an internship. Excuse me? And my wife wouldn't marry me if I didn't graduate. And so I just like, what's the fastest way out of here? And I got a degree in general studies, which is a little bit of everything or a lot of nothing. So I did that. And I didn't get what I was shooting for, but this guy wanted to intern, and he got that degree that I was hoping. Actually a master's, so he was pursuing. And I thought, this could add value, but I really need to be honest. He wants an internship with a company that's international and doing import and export. Like, okay, let me tell you about what my import currently looks like. See that suitcase?
Yeah.
That's great.
So we need to work on this business plan.
Yeah.
And he's actually who did most of the work. He designed the logo for Finca Vista Hermosa that my
nice.
wife then stenciled and cut it out on cardboard and spray painted on every bag.
Nice.
So we like every bag, like we painted, hand spray painted each one of them. This is in our house in Wewe, up in the mountains. So there was a lot of cost, and it just started snowballing, and we got a lot of great feedback. I remember like George Howell, he had started the Cup of Excellence with Susie Spindler, and he gave great feedback. He said, this is one of the best Guatemalan coffees I've ever had.
Whoa.
And a couple of years later, like he wanted a container, but frozen. I'm like, this is interesting, exciting, innovative, but will you pay for it in advance?
Yeah.
Like, well, no. Got to see how it works. But I can't take that risk. But I got a lot of good feedback from
George,
people.
of course, of all people. I'm not surprised.
Frozen for more.
Yeah.
So he came back with his wife and visited. So we had made a connection there.
Yeah.
And at the time, we had a lot of roasters that in the following years came to visit.
Wow.
And it came to the point where we had almost 100 roasters a year. Wow. This is
to one farm?
To our farm, and we'd take them to one or two others in the beginning, yeah.
Oh, okay. So at that point, are you also then creating a network of farmers and producers you're working with, or is this still like small and family oriented?
We developed a network. So I jumped a gap there about 5 years. So initially, it took me a year and a half to sell that first import.
Okay.
And I sold it for 89 cents a pound a year and a half later.
What was the C market then, do you know?
I don't remember, but I committed to pay $1.65 a pound. And the C market was below that.
Okay.
So, I sold it for like half of what I committed to pay for it about 18 months later.
Yeah.
And a lot of time sunk into that as well. And I sold it all, I'm not going to say to who, but I sold it all to one person.
Wow.
Just because I needed to sell it.
Yeah.
And I was sitting on it.
Yeah.
And everybody told me, I mean, this is talk about learning from pain. Everybody told me, we love your coffee. Like, great, how much do you want? Oh, I can't buy any right now.
Classic.
And that's where I learned about the planning and the commitments.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Wow, that's just incredible. Yeah, so you guys are now growing. You guys are, you're building a network. What does connecting with I'm assuming that there's not as many roasters as there are right now. Like right now, there's a heavy saturated market of roasters.
Mm-hmm.
What was that like finding roasters? Like, was it like a difficult find, or I don't know. I was not in coffee back then, so
Yeah, I think especially for us right now, like everything is heavy and driven by like social media. And I would assume, is this like before the major like online social media boom? Like give us an era time here.
Okay. So here's a couple random data points. Before I dove in, so I've been going to SEA for over a couple decades. And I went and interviewed every single importer I could find. And it was mostly multinationals, but there were a lot of smaller independents. Mm-hmm. And I asked them, here's what I want to do. I want to bring our own coffee up, and I want to import, and then maybe from some other neighbors as well. Mm-hmm. And almost every one of them said, don't do it. It's too difficult. It's very complex, and it's not lucrative. The margins are small. It's a volume game.
Yeah.
And they were not trying to dissuade me because they were concerned that I was going to compete with them. Mm-hmm. Like I was kind of a laughable, annoying. They were genuinely being kind, I believe, wanting to be helpful. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so every single one of them said, don't do it, very kindly, except for one person. And her name is Erna Knudsen, and she's who coined the term specialty coffee. So she was cupping at the age of 14. She's from Norway, and she was cupping at 14 in New York. When women did not work in coffee, in business, in trade.
Yeah.
And she was cupping and learning quality.
Yeah.
And so she started, her own company, and she passed away in her mid-90s. And my wife and I went down to try and buy her company in San Francisco. And she said, no, my exit plan is death. And if I die, my husband's still alive, talk to him. That was it. Like, we flew down just to try and make an offer and talk about it. And like, that's as far as the conversation went.
Gosh, that's powerful.
But she encouraged me because she said, I only know one person who's doing what you want to do, and they're doing really well. And like, well, tell me about it. And it's a guy named, to this day, I've not met him, Bill McAlpin. And he bought a farm in Costa Rica called La Minita and invested in really great processing, really good processing.
Okay.
So the quality coming off that farm was great. So I was talking to a lot of people that were excited about that quality, and they were paying a price that reflected the work that took to get there.
Yeah.
So that to me was enough.
Yeah.
There's 150,000 farmers in Guatemala. At the time, 65,000. No one's really doing this. There were a lot of larger farms that had direct trade relationships long before people invented direct trade.
Yeah.
But they had resources. They weren't stretching to do it. A lot of farmers that maybe had other businesses. So most of the farms in Guatemala are very small to mid-sized, and then you have a few that are larger. And when I say few, maybe a few hundred out of 125,000 that are producing 10 to 50 containers versus 10 to 50 bags.
Gotcha.
And so for us, we're not the big guys. We're not the smallest, but we're definitely in that small bucket. And so the accessibility was unimaginable. But when Erna encouraged me, I said, all right, I'm doing it.
Yeah.
That's all I needed. So having sent samples out, having people say that they liked the coffee and they wanted it, I thought, okay, this year's going to be terrible. And if I can live through this, next year's going to be good. So the next year I more than doubled down. I went 3 times as much volume.
Yeah.
And it was all sold before it shipped.
Wow. That's powerful.
And so I continued that trend for a few years, and then, just started learning all sorts of other growing pains of business.
Yeah. That's incredible. There's just so much solid information. So thanks for sharing all of that. That's an awesome story. I did have a lingering question, as I want to wrap this up soon because we're we're going pretty long on this episode, which I'm not mad about. But I did want to say is now you own Onyx, you're running it. I don't know how many roasters you guys serve, but I'm assuming it's a lot, us being one of them. How has everything kind of like your past life with, growing up on a farm, moving here, being a cafe owner, roasting a little bit even, how has all that played a role in you being the owner of, Onyx Coffee Importers? Like, as opposed to somebody who maybe just said, hey, I want to become an importer. I'm kind of intrigued in international business. What do you think, how has your past history, your life impacted what you're doing right now, presently with Onyx?
Well, I think just seeing how hard it is to produce something great, how much risk goes into it, how much time it takes, and seeing that the reward is rarely justifying the work. So, like, why would you do something? You either do it because you love it or because you need to. You just don't have a choice.
Yeah.
And that's the answer for most people growing coffee. And sometimes you bounce back and forth. Sometimes it's like, all right, I love it, and as long as I can do it, I'm just going to do it because I love it. And there's a lot of reward. I think anytime you work hard on anything, over time you gain some level of appreciation. Even if you don't love it, you appreciate the work. You appreciate that it takes work to accomplish something.
Yeah.
And so that was just constantly leaving me very humbled, seeing how much work went into producing coffee, and then learning that it's just too cheap, and that the cost of production is often a little bit or a lot higher than what people are selling it for. 6 out of 7 years, for decades, for generations.
Wow.
So coffee, the market's up right now, but it's still not much different than when I was born.
Yeah.
Like, what other product, consumable, like a gallon of milk or whatever food staple, can you think of that has not gone up in 4 or 5 decades? So that's just always kind of burning in my mind, and I think that's probably the biggest driver for Onyx, because I feel that growing up bilingual and studying business, it's just not fair. Like, what is everyone else going to do?
Right.
I took some risks and had some big pains, and then got to a point where we could connect our coffee to people that really valued it. But I'm not doing any more work than our neighbors in terms of growing coffee. I'm not taking any more risk in terms of growing coffee. And so just finding ways to essentially facilitate more connections of quality-driven farmers with quality-driven roasters.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of complicated ways to try and check boxes to see what's a good fit, because really at Onyx what we're doing is we're matchmakers.
Yeah.
Because I don't want to do the work over and over and over again. I want to grow relationship and grow value. I want both a roaster and a farmer to see a long-term future. Anytime someone's thinking short term, I don't want to criticize that, but it's not sustainable.
Yeah.
It's just not.
It's reactive.
It's not sustainable.
Yeah. Exactly.
And it's not nearly as rewarding either. And you just have to constantly navigate so many challenges. I mean, you asked about the era when I started importing, and one of the first customers, one of my first cold calls was at Victrola on 15th Avenue. And
That's beautiful.
there's a manager, David Latourelle, and he helped launch Clover. And actually, the Clover debut was in the new Victrola location, which is what's on Pike right now, new at that time.
Wow.
And
I didn't know that. Huh.
And there's this quiet guy in the back who was chained to an IR12. It's the same roaster you have.
Yes.
His name is Tony. He goes by Tonks, and he sold eventually that Tonks to Blue Bottle and started Yes Please.
Oh, wow.
And so he was roasting in the back.
Wow.
Kyle Glanville from Go Get 'Em Tiger, or G&B. So he was a very shy barista that was just sitting in the back room as I did a presentation on on our farm and coffee, and it felt really awkward.
Yeah.
And they looked at me, and I don't know what they thought. And the owners, I think he was a computer programmer, Chris and Jen. They since I helped them facilitate selling the company to someone else that I met that also was roasting coffee, and and it was some of those early connections that helped, because we were all pretty naive and lost, and so Chris from Victrola, Chris and Jen, the owners, and then Tony, were both using WordPress to do a blog. So I started blogging, and I'm like, how many other people are doing this? And like, I looked around, there weren't very many blogs out there.
Wow. Yeah.
So for, a blog was kind of rare, and then to have a farmer blogging to consumers in North America.
Wow. That's very
So-
cutting edge, especially in that time. Yeah.
Yeah.
You sharing like so much history and like unpacking like that story. I think my big question then, and I don't know how much time we have. I mean, gosh, like this conversation, side note, is like really energizing me in two ways. Like, I'm just so excited to hear like what you're working on, but then I'm also inspired to know that like we have a journey and it's hard right now and we're working like hours, but we can continue going because of your story. So with that said, like, if you could look at just the course of time in the industry that you've experienced, is it like unveiling like a map to move forward? Like, because a lot of the things that you're sharing, like even the last thing you shared about like WordPress, that was such a new way of communicating the stories of like farmers. So it was pretty cutting edge. It didn't become mainstream for a long time. And even the things you shared about like sustainability and pricing, like those are like big conversations that we're having now, but it took such a long time for us to have those conversations and make them mainstream. So if you could share, I don't know, maybe you can't, I don't know. What are some things that you see in the industry or even within Onyx, within green coffee, like buyers and then farmers? Like, what are you seeing that you are thinking, man, in the future, this is what the conversation is going to be about? Big question.
It is a big question that requires answers that I think are unimaginable right now.
Okay.
But somehow they address problems that we can't solve collectively. And so what I mean by problems we can't solve are the challenge, historically, farmers take all the risk. And from there moving forward, the only risk is how much you choose to take. And there's some variables that really lock this strange dynamic in a bad place, where no matter how hard a producer works, that quality, it really can't ever be made better. You can only make it worse. There's lots of opportunities to mess it up. And the industry has traditionally been really good actually at preserving quality pretty decently, from farm to all the way up to the roaster. And then at that point, I'm not saying that the quality drops, but that's where you have this shotgun spread approach of expressions of that coffee. And so I think ultimately having, education is a really important piece. And education is expensive. But there's value that comes out of education. And that's kind of why I started Onyx Coffee Bar however many years back. Just because I wanted to learn how can education be sustainable. Because people pay to go to school. No one pays you to go to university. No one pays, people pay to go to school. But how can there be a model where it's economically sustainable or profitable to have a system that teaches for learning? But somehow that needs to happen in the entire supply chain, more understanding of what cost of production are and all the way through. And then appreciation for the product is, I think, ultimately going to be what drives. I was just messaging with the president of Ana Cafe, and they just launched a new brand for the Guatemalan Coffee Producers Association.
Okay. Wow.
And I'm really excited about it.
Yeah.
It's very bold and risky. It's not new or innovative. Colombia did this, but they're marketing to consumers instead of marketing to the industry.
Yep.
And so Colombia marketed heavily for decades into North America. So 20 years ago, I would talk to people about coffee, and they say, well, is it Colombian? If it's Colombian coffee, it's good. If not, then it's not good. Like Colombian coffee is good coffee.
Yeah, it used to be paired with like 100% Arabica and 100% Colombian. I remember seeing that was a big thing. Yeah.
So they just launched, and the idea, and this is bold, and the reason I say it's risky is because the cost for me to talk to a roaster, like it's a real cost. But if I want to talk to a consumer, now I'm talking to your customer.
Yeah.
And I can reach a lot more consumers by talking to you. But what Ana Cafe is doing is they're bypassing and they're talking to the consumers. So it's really assisting every link in between to lift the bar and the brand in some way.
Yeah.
So ultimately, I think it's just education
Yep.
through the supply chain that's going to bring more sustainability, because even today, the cost of production for most high quality coffees is not being covered by what's paid.
Wow.
And when the market does go up, a funny thing happens: quality goes down.
Interesting. Yeah.
Just leaving you with
leave you hanging with that.
with the mic drop.
It's really simple. What happens is if you get paid
Yeah.
a certain amount, and all of a sudden you get a huge raise, and it doesn't matter if you produce the same quality or better quality or worse, you just get paid no matter what.
Right.
Yeah.
Like then I'm like, well, you don't care. Like you're going to get that price.
Yeah.
And coffee as a commodity lives in that space.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
So if you don't have the incentive, you start thinking, well, I'm going to get a great price anyway, so I don't have to fight to differentiate with quality to get a little bit more. I'm going to get whatever that price is.
Yeah.
I think that kind of a little bit complicates this conversation about sustainability, because to me that also just means then, especially in specialty coffee, it's not just a matter of let's just raise the floor. That doesn't solve necessarily all the complications with that, which that's like that needs to be a whole other podcast episode. That Edwin, take this as an invite.
Yeah. This is powerful.
So,
I think even within that, like one, pricing, quality, and just the general concept of sustainability, like you brought up the example right now of like raising the floor. I think from just what I'm hearing, what I'm envisioning is like you have to do more than raise the floor. You have to like expand the whole room. You have to like create more room, but also like there has to be something like more drive. You know what I mean? So it's like, yeah, you picked up the pricing, but what is that going to produce? What is that raise in pricing going to produce for the future? So therefore, there can be another pickup, and it just doesn't stay at that area. We're not trying to squeeze that room. We're trying to expand it. So in a sense.
Yeah, you nailed it. I think that's. It's good to have a big picture view, because it's really easy when you learn more about anything to get really focused, and focus is great, but you can quickly lose sight of the bigger picture. And so, it's not just coffee, but within coffee, you can see where if there's a triangle, you got to lift the floor of that triangle, but you also need to work to lift the tip of the peak of that triangle. So find those shining stars and really, do some crazy things that people I've seen, I've enjoyed partnering with people where they invest and market heavily a really expensive coffee where no one ever really makes money on that, but there's just lots of joy and eyes are opened and these connections are made because there's something very real about, wow, not all coffee tastes the same.
Yeah. Oh,
so you're raising the peak, you're lifting the base, and then you said, expanding the space is, and that's all three of those I think are done with education, because every coffee has a home. So you got to find ways to talk at all these different levels to increase and expand appreciation for the product.
It's powerful. Yeah.
That is powerful.
Yeah. Well,
cool.
I think this is a good.
Yeah, that was awesome. Just a really great conversation. Thank you, Edwin, for coming on, sharing your, your past, your life, your journey and stuff. So that was really great. I love that we just had that over some Jorge Mendez, El Panal, which is wonderful. But yeah, that's going to be a wrap for this episode. Thank you guys so much. If you've been watching this on YouTube or if you've been, listening to us on the podcast, you can find Onyx Coffee on Instagram, on YouTube. You can find their website. They have their offering list, I believe, on there, some more of their background story. Mm-hmm. Anywhere else you would send people?
We're also doing honey.
Oh,
I guess that's another piece.
Yeah.
And that all started with Jorge.
Yeah.
Oh, awesome.
But Coffee Blossom Honey.
Yeah.
I don't know. Because we're B2B, it's very relationship-based. So connecting like this is very, very special.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Dude,
That's incredible.
I mean, I don't know. I just want to give myself a little pat in the back because there was a time where I was actually working behind the bar at Makeworth, and some of my friends who just rebranded a cafe to Visible Coffee Roasters came in, and they're starting to roast their coffee, and Maddie was there too. And I was like, yo, this is a connection. I literally run out of the bar. I'm like, you got to meet Maddie because you got to source like Guatemalan coffee with them. Like, this is it. And I believe they started, I don't know. I won't say anything, but I really hope that they're purchasing coffee from y'all because I was so pumped about making that connection. Yeah. But yeah, you're totally right on, man. Relationship makes the thing go forward.
I'll leave you with one last thing, just because I think it's just fascinating to see companies at different stages. Mm-hmm. And this is just, taking a step back, looking at a bigger picture of what happens over time. Mm-hmm. I've enjoyed having a lot of conversations like this over the years where I'm just going to recall one of them. It was another cold call, and I show up at this warehouse, and this place, it really should have been condemned. But I wanted to meet this guy because he was willing to talk to me. It was just that simple.
Yeah. That's awesome.
Other people wouldn't talk to me. He was curious, and he was roasting on, I think, an IR7, which now would be considered an IR3 because they used to list them in pounds, not kilos. So 7 pound or a 3 kilo Diedrich roaster. And he introduced me to one other person, and it just didn't really feel like a real business, but that was the best connection I could make. Mm-hmm. That's Olympia Coffee Roasters, and he ended up starting EspressoParts.com as well.
Wow!
And so that was a much humbler connection than you already have an established business with brand and
Yeah. Wow, man, such inspiring.
I think
stuff.
having a long-term focus and it's not just about passion. It's just having, I think, clear goals and why you're doing what you're doing is, of course, a big driver. Valuing relationships, being thoughtful about partnerships. That's something that I ask a lot of people to give me feedback on. Mm-hmm. And I'm constantly learning because your resources are limited. You have to make choices.
Yeah. So that's good. That's good. All right, folks. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you guys in the next one.
I'll see ya.